Shall we begin? Yeah. So, I will come. Alright. So, I will welcome all of you to the second day of our lecture series. And I welcome Professor Kaul for giving your time and your intellectual labor to be with us today and share your thoughts and your expertise with us. So before I give the time to him, I would like to introduce him. So Professor Mrinal Kaul teaches classical Indian philosophy at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, IITB, Mumbai. His research focuses on the non-dual Saiva philosophy, particularly the 10th century philosopher Abhinavagupta. His recent publications include Of So Meaning, titled What Does Abhinavagupta Mean by Non-Duality? That was published 2025 this year. And another one is Reflection Real According to Abhinavagupta? Dynamic Realism versus Night Realism, 2024. Both published in the Journal of Indian Philosophy, Spring. And a volume titled Minor Work of Abhinavagupta, edited together with Francesco Spira, is about to be published and published. So these are his recent publications apart from many other publications. So we are looking forward to your talk. Now I give time to you and you can have the liberty of the time to share your thoughts and
I should start by thanking Dr. Karilema and Dr. Harish Navale, who is the head, and Professor Tandon here. Thank you so much for inviting me to this prestigious lecture series. The Ranade Endowment, I think it is a pleasure to be here. I was in 2004 a student around here in the Center of Advanced Studies in Sanskrit. So I was just telling them that I would very often sneak out and meet Professor Gokhale here. It was that time. So what I think I'm going to present in front of you is a work. I mean, in many segments it is in progress. So I think there's a book coming soon, Minor Works of Abhinavagupta, edited with critical editions of some of the stotras or hymns by him, attributed to him. So it will be published in Naples in Italy. So a part of the presentation is woven around that. And another part of the presentation is another lecture which I have tried to kind of put them together to make my point, what I want to say. So I think I wanted to complicate this idea of, in English you may call it devotion, in Sanskrit you may call it bhakti, and I have tried to say this is the mapping the metaphysics of devotion in Abhinavagupta. But the first title, Praying the Dynamic Quotidian, should be understood as praying to the dynamic quotidian. And I think I'll explain that what quotidian means for Abhinavagupta. I'll come to that, which in other sense means our, in Shankara's language, for instance, vyavaharika jagat, vyavaharika sat, no? Reality. Whether that is to be sublated or not, that is Vedanta's concern, the other Advaita system. This is also an Advaita system. But as one of the Abhinavagupta scholars, Professor K.C. Pandey, used to use the term realistic idealism. This tata, that is to say that it is nothing but the manifestation of Shakti. What does that mean? We can try to understand through and praying to that dynamic quotidian. Of course, we need to understand that prayer idea. What does it mean? Praying means what? So I'm trying to complicate the idea of prayer as well. Prayer here means worship and so on, so whatever. And of course, that is what I mean by devotion. Not the bhakti movement, I'm not invoking any historical ideas here. So that's what I'm trying to map. Like, what does it mean? What does prayer mean / worship mean? And what does it mean? The idea of praying to the dynamic quotidian. So we are in a sense saying that the prayer is to be done to the loka, the ness of everydayness. Right? What does that mean? I mean, it sounds like, oh, okay, it's nice, but what does it mean? So, with the beginning tribute to Professor Ramachandra Dattatreya Ranade, in whose memory and honor we are speaking here, we are trying to remember here, I'll try to kind of connect the whole idea with one small paragraph towards the end. I should be thankful for the very generosity of time. I have a lot of time, so. But mostly I'll map, I think, reading what I have. To me and my discipline disclosed by a learned scholar who thought that the domain of knowledge I practiced was inferior to his own, was ungrounded, it was still frustrating. His brand of wisdom was clearly unjust, rooting his conviction in a biased historical prejudice. He averted that logic and reason alone were superior domains of philosophical thinking. This pathetic display of self-adulation was no surprise to me. After all, I still am used to my discipline, tantric philosophy, being caricatured as an impure tradition. Not to give the impression that I am against logic and reasoning. Far from it. However, I am curious on how to enrich philosophical reasoning by adding an inventive dimension which tantric philosophy can help us with. And if my project comes to sound anti-philosophical, if you understand what I mean there by anti-philosophical, that may actually be a good thing. The history of Tantra has fundamentally been about transgressing conventional mode of thinking. And Indian philosophy, whatever we mean by Indian there, all the more so. Another audio that I was reminded of was that of my teacher, Pandit Hemendranath Chakravarti from Benares, a student of the famous tantric philosopher Pandit Gopinath Kaviraj. I recall once Pandit Chakravarti mentioning to me how he was loathed in a Pandita Sabha, intellectual gathering, as a destitute, quote-unquote, expert in the left-handed doctrine. So some big Pandits call him, just look at this, who is coming, Vamacharya. That was like a derogatory comment. No, who is this Vamacharya? That was to say that, what does he know? He only knows the toilet and sex stuff. This confirms exactly to my colleagues' impressions that the focus of my research is nothing more than, quote-unquote, grotesque and perverted toilet and sex stuff, unquote. This pathology of my dear colleague has a strong precedent in the literature of colonial Orientalists on Tantra. Even the native scholars gradually consumed the same narrative. Consider the preface that Vinay Tosh Bhattacharya, so his dates are 1897 to 1964, he wrote to the first book or first edition of his book, An Introduction to Buddhist Esotericism. Bhattacharya served as the general editor of the prestigious Gaikwad Oriental series in Baroda, and he was the director of the Oriental Institute of Baroda University for about 25 years, from 1927 to 1952. This is what he said in the preface to this book, published in 1932. So I'm reading an excerpt from this book. If at any time in the history of India the mind of the nation as a whole has been diseased, it was in the Tantric age, or the period immediately preceding the Mohammedan conquest of India. The story related in the pages of numerous Tantric works is supposed to be so repugnant that, excepting a few, all respectable scholars have condemned them wholesale and left the field of Tantra severely alone. But in spite of what the great historians of Sanskrit literature have said against Tantrism and the Tantric literature, no one should forget that the Hindu population of India as a whole is even today in the grip of this very Tantra in its daily life, customs and usages, and suffering from the same disease which originated 1300 years ago and consumed its vitality slowly but surely during long centuries. Someone should therefore take up the study comprising the diagnosis, etiology, pathology and prognosis of the disease. Of course, disease is Tantric philosophy. So that more capable men may take up its treatment and eradication in the future. Unquote. As examined by Who's or Urban, the history of Tantricism in colonial South Asia was largely a product of Orientalist scholarship. And conceivably, my colleague and Bhattacharya's understanding of Tantricism was also the result of colonial imagination. I believe you have had a lecture yesterday morning on decolonizing. I couldn't hear it online, but I think some of my colleagues told me that there was a... So that little bit play is there. But for me, so I'm saying that my colleague and Bhattacharya's understanding of Tantrism was also the result of colonial imagination. But for me, my own lived experience was stronger than reading about it in Bhattacharya or Urban. Lived experience is more strongly felt than merely reading about it. I wrestled with comprehending this anti-tantric phenomenon. And of course, I returned for answers to the tantric philosopher I studied closely, Abhinavagupta, the 11th century philosopher. The terms like Tantra, Tantricism, Tantric philosophy, etc. may be significantly eclectic categories. Since my engagement is limited to Abhinavagupta here and his non-dual tradition alone, I strictly use the category Tantric philosophy to mean how Abhinavagupta interprets his Tantric sources. If Tantric traditions, most notably, taught a certain egalitarian social behavior, preaching a transgressive and anti-normative approach, achieved through an altruistic act, so keep bhakti in mind, it was pertinent for me to explore the fundamental categories involved in there, i.e. the category of bheda, understood as duality, distinction, difference, discrimination, and abheda, because that's the whole play, bheda and abheda. And abheda understood as non-duality, non-difference, non-distinction, non-discrimination. These two categories can serve as vehicles of the transgressive potentials I was keen to trace. They can help destabilize ossified and biased narratives on Tantric philosophy and could also create some scope for change. Here, by change, I mean alteration and not replacement, i.e. not, for instance, that today's class teacher changed from Mrinal to Muzaffar, who was a colleague here. But the changing of Mrinal with respect to Mrinal himself. This dynamism of change is how Abhinavagupta defines the unity of action. And it is this unity of action that is the core, inner fabric of the I, Aham consciousness. I.e., Aham not in the sense of egoity, right? The ego category. The self category, I. I.e., the unity of duality and non-duality. So we are talking of a certain unity, synthesized unity of duality and non-duality. Purity and impurity. No? Knowledge and action. Jnana and kriya. Right? One and many. Distinction and non-distinction. So on and so forth. I mean, you can invoke n number of binaries for a philosophical exercise. The lofty edifice of Abhinavan metaphysics is rooted in this fundamental principle of I consciousness. That is further conceptualized into the theory of absolute non-duality. Abhinava would argue that in an action or event, the oneness of action is paradoxically proven by the principle of change itself. I.e., when an entity is undergoing a change, we are basically proving the change with respect to the entity itself. The same entity that is subject to change. It is not, for instance, that we are trying to prove the change with respect to change. I.e., when the pen is changing, for instance, whatever that would mean, the change of the pen from, let's say, getting older, faded, or it stops working being a pen, and so on and so forth, would be something with respect to the pramata, the knower, the self. Right? So that would be, in that sense, this is subject. That is to say, this is subject to be manifested in the self, that is I. Otherwise, I mean, in his system, for instance, of course, this realistic notion that whether the pen still is or is not, no? But for that's a question. But from another point of view, the idea that pen is a pen when it is manifested in the consciousness of the knower. It's a very simple philosophical idea. The change itself cannot be changed. But the potentiality of this change is also hidden in the idea of inverseness. That what changes. Think, now I'm trying to give examples, for instance. Think of the world being inverse, i.e., the possibility of everything being opposite to what it is. No? You can think of when Shankara in the beginning says, the light and darkness and so on and so forth, he opens up the Adhyasavasya. If light exists in what? The opposition of darkness, in the absence of darkness, and the vice versa, and so on and so forth. Think of the world being inverse, i.e. the possibility of everything being opposite to what it is, like a reflected form in a mirror, like conceptualizing or transforming pure into impure, and impure into pure, or contemplating the non-distinction between a piece of gold and a piece of feces, literally. I mean, to use the informal term, shit. I mean, this is not me saying this, Abhinavagupta would say. There should be no distinction between the two. This was the transgressive project of Abhinavagupta. But something more important was at stake for Abhinavagupta. How to address the perennial tension between knowledge and action, jnana and kriya, or kriya as an experience also, or theory and praxis. He completely refused to accept the distinction between the two. For him, knowledge is imbued with action. The action aspect of knowledge resonates to the power of discernment or distinction or discrimination. This power lets us judge what is real or unreal, distinguish right from wrong, or judge what is good or bad. Ironically, as I perceive, the same power of discrimination in its negative meaning may represent inequality, prejudice, bias, bigotry. So, if I am a discriminator, it could lead to diametrically opposing positions. It could mean I am a bigot, or it may mean I am a sensitive person with subtle perceptiveness. I am a Vivekin, for instance. No? I have the Vivek So using an illustration of a pot or a jar, ghata, as you would, I'm sure many of you have read Tarka Sangraha, no, that's what it takes. This is the basic logic. So if using an illustration of a pot or a jar, if Abhinavagupta were asked how he would define the distinction between a pot and a non-pot, he would answer that it is due to the knowing subject establishing a relationship between two mutually opposing categories like a pot and a non-pot. A pot is always a pot and a non-pot is always a non-pot. And these two mutually opposing categories are brought together or fused together to mentally exclude each other in the substratum of a singular conscious awareness of the knowing subject. So in a sense, you are thinking this is distinct from this, but what consciousness is doing, it is bringing them together. It is our habit to see this is distinct from this, but actually what consciousness is doing in terms of the mutually opposing categories, it actually synthesizes the two mutually opposing categories from that point of view. No? Of course, the common epistemic functionality also becomes possible because of the same distinction. For instance, I do not eat a plate, but eat food when food is brought to me on a plate. This discernment or judgment that X is different from Y means establishing a relationship, sambandha, between them by bringing them together. Food and plate are not interested in themselves, but I am interested in myself, besides being interested in the two of them and their relationship, sambandha. For Abhinava, this sensitive insight, the power of discrimination or discernment, is a binding force. No? So that is the Shakti, for instance. He uses the term contemplative awareness, which is usually translated as contemplative awareness, which for him is the Vimarsha Shakti, so the term he would use, for instance. The unease with my colleague elicited by his comment had made me question whether Abhinavagupta's tantric philosophy can address the problem of distinction, difference or discrimination in the world that we live in today. Tantric philosophical traditions also seem to be the right choice for asking these questions, since they have been intensely marginalized and stereotyped in India, as is clear from Bhattacharya's quote that I just mentioned above. Tantric traditions have also, if not directly but indirectly, closely touched upon the human aspect of the subjective experience of lived reality. This lived reality of humans is imbued with the inhibitions and practices of purity and impurity. Abhinavagupta's hermeneutic effort advances towards transgressing or violating the behavior of the mind. While I am aware that not all tantric aesthetics can be reduced to Abhinavagupta alone, I suggest that underlying this subjective experience is the core of Abhinavagupta's aesthetic philosophy, which I have called his tantric aestheticism. In what follows, I want to argue that Abhinavagupta's model of the non-duality of I consciousness is a strong candidate for understanding affective phenomena. I suggest it is only possible to achieve this oneness by being aesthetically sensitive. And a good example of this is the concept of servitude, what I will try to say a little bit more about, the dasya bhava, or devotion, or love. I will attempt to map the metaphysics of this sensitive servitude and argue that its potential is concealed in an aesthetic act that, in turn, is encoded in the quotidian metaphysics. My term, I'll try to explain that. The metaphysics of the absolute is beautifully manifested in the conventionality of what I have chosen to call quotidian metaphysics. What I mean by quotidian metaphysics is that the being of the reality of our day-to-day common experience, loka vyavahar, jagat vyavahar, is both beyond and constituting of our experience. So I'll repeat it. What I mean by Quotidian metaphysics is that the being of the reality of day-to-day common experience is what? It is both beyond and constituting of our experience. No? You can say in Shankara's terminology, which you may be more familiar with, it is both paramarthika and vyavaharika. Here, being is this. No? Right? It is the metaphysics of real and more than real phenomena of being. As a side note, we must keep in mind that the dualistic Shaiva doctrines, so just a side note here that, when I say Abhinavagupta, this also should be seen as, let's say, largely this what we call non-dual Shaiva philosophy, which gets very often in today's scholarship for a long time, almost 100 years, represented by this one terminology, which is this Kashmir Shaivism, which I have serious problems with for a number of reasons. But I would rather, devote another lecture to that. But it's better to call it non-dual Shaiva philosophy, the Paramatvaitavada, Paramatvaita system, and so on and so forth. That's one side of it, but the other side of it is that as far as the tradition is concerned of this non-dual Shaiva philosophy, it begins somewhere in 9th-ish. There is a big shift. There is that Kohenian revolutionary move in the 9th century, where the earlier sources, tantric sources, agamas, which were all dualistic, they were propounding all dualistic theses, they were all gradually changed or converted. So there is this new emergence of non-dual. How and why, that becomes also partly a historical question, so we are not dealing with that here. But in that context, I am mentioning this because this is important. As a side note, we must keep in mind that the dualistic Shaiva doctrines, like the earlier ones, upheld strong inhibitions vis-a-vis impurity, following the Vedic boundaries of grammatical purity. But the non-dual Shaiva Tantricism included transgressive contact with impure substances, persons, etc. While they attributed great power to contact with impurity, they also prescribed sexual rituals advocating adultery, caste mixing, and even incest. To summarize briefly the doctrines of the Siddhanta, not dual Siddhanta Shaivism, Siddhanta Shaivism were predominantly based on physical ritual performances that were regarded as absolutely essential and also formed the very foundation of the dualistic Shaiva soteriology. As opposed to this, the non-dual Shaivism offered lesser importance to physical rituals and focused more on internalizing the physical rituals through meditative visualizations. So now it's like from externality to internality. That's more in focus. Abhinavagupta, indeed, along with his previous masters like Somananda, Utpaladeva and Lakshmanagupta, and with his successors like Kshemaraja and Jayarata, should be seen as championing the cause of this transformative shift that interprets a physical ritual in terms of knowledge-based conceptualization that emphasizes mind-born realities located in the subjective awareness of the knowing subject, the pramata. This subjective awareness is ubiquitous, as much as it encapsulates subjective and objective realities within itself, and is interpreted as non-dual reality by the same virtue. With this gradual shift, the action, kriya, was brought to the fold of jnana or meditation, and it was possible to mentally perform a physical ritual from Abhinava's point of view. What I have called, now moving slightly, shifting the ideas, what I have called metaphysics of servitude in the non-dual Shaiva philosophy should not be understood as the submission of a weaker agent to a stronger hegemonic force. This servitude, dasya bhava, so dasasya bhava, dasya bhava, so you are that idea of me realizing myself as a, let's say, servant. So that's what servitude means, the dasya bhava. This servitude, for want of a better word, signifies, for instance, submission in love. When we are deeply in love with our lover, we selflessly submit or surrender our agency to our loved one. We want them to enjoy our servitude, which is only possible as long as they want us to enjoy serving them willingly. So, the example of the slave and the master would not fit here. This submission is intentional, i.e., it is exercising one's free will, what he would call Swatantra Shakti, one's free will, the power of volition, Ichha Shakti. No one can compel me to love my lover. No? I mean, you can really think of that idea, I mean, somebody puts me in a jail and says that, okay, now love someone. No? I may hate someone like that, but that's also not possible, according to him. So this submission is experiencing the power of one's freedom and letting your beloved experience their freedom by submitting themselves to or serving you. Otherwise, why does a lover love? Even a materialist, if Charvaka is a materialist, even a materialist Charvaka father loves his Charvaka son. Thus, if this empirical and material world is the supreme reality, or in his language Maheshwarya, the state of being Mahesha, the power of the great Mahesha, one would naturally aim to attain servitude of this world as a freely offered act of love. Experiencing the supreme ambrosia of the devotion of the Supreme Lord and engaging with the banality of this beautiful empirical reality can thus become synonymous. For Abhinava to salute, now I am translating many terms here from Sanskrit, so there will be English terms. For Abhinava to salute, understand the namana, the prostrating and namaskara and so on and so forth, these terms used. For Abhinava to salute, to prostrate, to greet, or words signifying what in Sanskrit, this is his interpretation in the beginning of this Ishvara Pratabhigna Vimarshini. Words signifying Jayati. No? A lot of people all over the world, if not in India alone, keep celebrating Jayantis. Okay, whether it's born or dead or something. But nobody, I'm not saying I'm doing that, I'm the big one who is doing that. But I think what's important is to contemplate what does that mean. Jayati means what? The only word Jaya, which is often translated as victorious, what does it mean? And that's what he is trying to illustrate in the beginning of one of his works, this commentaries. For Abhinava, to salute, to prostrate, or to greet, all words signifying Jayati, means bringing light before one's own as well as other people's consciousness by means of inner visualization and an outer expression respectively. The word Jayati is often glossed as in Sanskrit Sarvotkarasha, meaning totally exceeding or overflowing, and its essential characteristic is freedom or absolute autonomous nature. Let us explore what Abhinava himself understood by the word Jaya and in how many different ways can we interpret Jaya. In the beginning of his commentary on the Ishvara Pratabhigna of Utpaladeva, his teacher, titled Vimarshini, Abhinava says, and I am paraphrasing this translation from the translation of Iyer and Pandey, and this is quoted. In this non-dual Shaiva system, salutation, prostration means surrender, consisting in the dedication of body, speech and mind, manasa, vachasa, karmana, exclusively to the great Lord. A wise man ought to make that surrender only if he realizes the superiority of the object of his devotion. Superiority of the object of his devotion. Otherwise, if he, unaware of any justification, bows to that which is not supreme, he would fall in the category of ordinary men. Right? Unquote. What does surrender, or what he would in Sanskrit calls prahvata, what does surrender or prahvata mean here? Surrender or prahvata means bowing down in humility, and here it means bowing down in humility to oneself, thus also invoking the idea of compassion and altruism. In other words, a subject manifests into other subject or other object. So it is that you literally manifest into your own other, right? This pen is nothing but my own manifestation. That's literally what he is trying to say. So he gives an example which I haven't quoted here, which is basically an example exhausted from one of his teachers, you can say, like 4 teachers, Somananda. And the simple example, for instance, given is that in very epistemological terms, I have a pot in front of me. Do I know a pot? Yes, I know. That's, of course, the Nayayika's question. The question is more reflective here. Does a pot know me? So then it becomes a little difficult idea. Does a pot know me? How does a pot know me? Now his argument would be, the system's argument would be that you cannot know a pot unless pot is also knowing you. There is no way possible that you know a pot without pot knowing you. Pot is also, of course, knowing you at the same time. One problem comes of the conscious and inert categories, that I am a conscious pramata and this is an inert pramata, so how do I? But his argument would be because it is basically nothing, it is the manifestation of your own self as, let's say, not the objectified reality but other subjectified reality. It is almost like subject manifesting itself into the other subject, if you have to say that, no? If terminologies matter. Right. But the questions still doesn't, that question becomes also complicated further, which is not something that we are concerned about here, but which becomes a further problem in the philosopher's mind, for instance, is that, okay, I know a pot, pot knows me, but can I know pot's knowing of me? Right? And then vice versa. Is it ever possible for me to know pot's knowing of me? No? That is never possible from one point of view, right? So, how they address those questions and stuff, that's a slightly tangential question. But this is what I mean. If the language here isn't clear, I'll try to read it again, but that's what I meant. Prahavata, surrender, means bowing down in humility, and here it means bowing down in humility to oneself, thus also invoking the idea of compassion and altruism. In other words, a subject manifests into other subject, no? Or other object, if you want to call it other object, and establishing an intersubjectivity. Dedicating body, speech and mind exclusively to the great Lord means realizing the intensity or the overflow of oneself through the other in one's own awareness. As Isabel Rathier, one of my good colleagues, says, and I quote her, from the point of view of the Pratyabhijna philosophers, so Pratyabhijna is a term which is often given to the epistemological side of this non-dual Shaiva system, which literally means recognition, philosophy of recognition. From the point of view of the Pratyabhijna philosophers, otherness is not only a problem as regards the way we become aware of others' presence, nor only regards the way we can consider that we share perceived objects with other perceiving subjects. For whether from the Vijnanavadas, that is to say Buddhist idealists, and loosely using the translation, for whether from the Vijnanavadas or from Pratyabhijna's perspectives, the question of otherness is linked to that of compassion, kripa, karuna, unquote. The category of reason is not left bereft either in this process, and it is not a solipsist process, because as Abhinavagupta himself would continue to say, now here again for a quote from his commentary which is called Vimarshini on Ishvara Pratyabhijna of Utpala. I have used the translation here. It's not my translation, it's the translation of Professor Pandey. Mostly, if I don't acknowledge, I think the translators, they are my own translations. So, what does he say in one place in the commentary? I'm reading the translation of that specific part. The all-inclusive universal consciousness is spontaneously relished by him on whom the higher grace has fallen and personal effort plays no part in it. For all that being essentially a manifestation of Maya, the principle of obscuration, one has to be very careful with these categories, because the mess in many of these Indian philosophical discourses are, the mess that is created between all Maya is same and so on and so forth. This Maya is completely different from Advaita Vedanta's Maya, right? So be very, very careful. It's like walking on the edge of the sword. For all that being essentially a manifestation of Maya, the principle of obscuration, and therefore unilluminative like darkness, cannot be a means to the knowledge of the pure light, which is beyond Maya, and therefore is the opposite of the manifestation. The pure light, and I'll try to elaborate some of these phrases. Pure light, what does it mean? I have sections to elaborate upon that. The pure light, as presented above, should however be clearly apprehended by calling to the mind some words such as Jayati, what I was just referring to, which stands for all surpassing greatness, with a view to bringing it before one's own as well as other people's consciousness by means of inner visualization and an outer expression respectively. This is what I said sometime back. Therefore, when a word expressive of salutation is used, the meaning of Jayati should be considered to be implied in it. This implication idea, for instance, if you go to Advaita Vedanta, sorry, I'm falling back to Advaita Vedanta often because I think students may have more familiarity with that Advaita brand, let's call it. There are many Advaitas, no? So, but the Mahavakya, for instance, this is that Devadatta, no? Tattvamasi, this is that Devadatta. And there is implication. There is no, they would say that, of course, Devadatta is meant to be there, whether by Jahal Lakshana, whether by both Jahal Lakshana, and so on and so forth. The idea is somewhat same here, that when you say Jayati, what is meant to be there. But from another point of view, the idea is that, let's say, from historical point of view also, dualists, you are stuck in the physicality of the ritual. Now, physicality of the ritual will make sense if it is corresponding to the mental implication that I want to achieve something through that mental modification. To do this, intentionality is fulfilled, no? That I do it and achieve it, right? But if you are doing ritual for the sake of ritual and there is no corresponding mental intentionality fulfilled, like bhavana idea, no? Whether you get it from the Kavya Shastra or whether you get from Mimamsakas, both same. The intentionality is not fulfilled unless you have the involvement of the self. Yeah. That's the emphasis, no? That is why he is emphasizing on that idea that it is implied, but this is what should also be invoked. So, therefore, when a word expressive of salutation is used, the meaning of Jayati should be considered to be implied in it. Even while uttering the word Jaya, if a person does not surrender himself to him who is possessed of supreme greatness and remains indifferent to him, he does a great disservice to himself. And later he says he does a great disservice to himself and humanity. Right? Therefore, when Jaya is used, surrender, which is involved in the visualization of supreme greatness, must be understood to be implied. Accordingly, then you use any word, either Jaya or Namaskara is used, the other should be necessarily considered to be implied. The same thing holds good for Vandana, Namana, Smrana, Pradhanya, etc. because their real meaning is nothing more than the feeling of surrender, coupled with the visualization of the supremacy of the Supreme. Unquote. The above introduction should let us have a smooth entry into the notion of bhakti in Abhinavagupta. This is only introduction so far. I hope I will have time to go ahead. In what follows, I will present to you an analysis of some of the short works and stotras attributed to Abhinavagupta that would also be a further illustration of exhibiting the non-dual model of pure devotion. I will focus on the concepts of non-duality and light and luminosity that will help me to create a fertile ground for exhibiting the pure nature of non-dual devotion. Because, majority of times, this is for students, majority of times, many of these words and terminology and concepts, they are simply, in my understanding, abused. Now, how many times do you use or understand the word? One is, of course, self, but self-realization. Self-knowledge. No? All Babajis in Indian context will use the word self-realization, self-knowledge, self-achievement, something and so on and so forth. I mean, they're so complicated concepts at the first place, at least for philosophers, if not for Babajis, if Babaji is a philosopher. So, what I mean to say is that's why one has to pay attention to terminology first of all. I'll focus on the concepts of non-duality and light and luminosity that will help me to create a fertile ground for establishing the pure nature of non-dual devotion. Now, it's so easy to say for me that, pure devotion. What does that mean? What does that purity idea mean? And so on and so forth. This purity, as we will see, includes both the categories of purity and impurity. Now, that's the problematic term, which is also its very inner fabric. This should also help us understand why Abhinavagupta's metaphysics is quotidian. Resolving this metaphysical tension between the internal and the external is the subject matter of many philosophical stotras of Abhinavagupta, or at least the ones attributed to him. I think I'll be clear gradually what stotra means. I think I've tried to also question that, the very ontological question of it. Usually it means a hymn or a poem of praise, for instance. No? And it is usually full of devotion to whosoever you are praising and so on and so forth. So, that's my second step towards problematizing the idea of devotion. No. Resolving the metaphysical tension between the internal and the external is the subject matter of many philosophical stotras of Abhinavagupta, where many of the otherwise terse and cumbersome philosophical and doctrinal concepts have been put forward following an unadorned idiom that is intelligible by someone who has no access to profound shastric discourse and its technical or scholastic language. In the history of South Asian literature, stotras have hardly been the domain of intellectual or shastric rigor, and probably for the same reason they have often been marginalized, they have often received marginalized treatment from many modern academics. Like folklore, and unlike canonical literature, most stotras may have fugitive and nomadic lives that are to be threaded together to situate their unruly maps. No? What a kavya can tell you, that is to say what let's say a certain kavya of Kalidasa can tell you, or if you go on the roadside somewhere listening to some folk tale in Marathi, for instance, what that can tell you is going to be something completely different. Right? This is also because they are the primary and potent vehicles of the dynamic transmission of devotion, I mean the stotras. As recently argued by Hamsa Stenton in his book Poetry and Prayer in the Sanskrit Hymns of Kashmir 2019, stotra literature is yet to carve out a full-fledged ontological space in the robust academic practice, and Stenton has made a strong case for it. This was, however, a contrary practice in pre-modern South Asia, where we witness that the best of the philosophers composed stotras, and in some cases at least we have even they have been exalted poets. Apart from Abhinavagupta, one may mention Dharmakirti, Anandavardhana, Jayanta Bhatta, Utpaladeva, or Shankara himself. If you attribute sutras to him, that's another problematic point. The stotra genre exhibits a unique texture, encapsulating the robustness of thought, sometimes the simplicity of expression, and yet other times the terseness of language, ornate idioms, embellishment of figures, exhibition of pedantry on the part of poets, or merely the play of words, including the use of puns, harmoniums, and complex compounds. In the rather simple, ornate style stotras of Abhinavagupta, moot philosophical points can achieve a smooth rhythm of discernment. For instance, his Anuttarashtika, one of the stotras, alone is a beautiful poetic rendering of the philosophical doctrine of means without means, Anupaya, in his Anuttaratrika Shaiva philosophy that he introduces in the second chapter of the Encyclopedic Tantric Manual, the Tantraloka. Abhinavagupta is strictly functioning within the core of Trika Shaivism, and his Shaiva metaphysics and Pratyabhijna epistemology are intricately woven together with his Shaiva aesthetics. This is a unique alliance of metaphysics, epistemology, and aesthetics. The culmination of this intricately fabricated structure is deeply rooted in the notion of bhakti, devotion, which is also manifest in his lucid stotras. Bhakti alone triumphs, suggests Utpaladeva, the Grand Master of Abhinavagupta, in his Shivastotravali. So one of his teachers, like let's say teachers, I don't think he studied with him, but teacher Utpaladeva, he wrote this very epistemologically elite work of Ishvara Pratyabhijna, the recognition of the Lord. And Abhinavagupta commented, he wrote several commentaries. But same Utpaladeva, he has written a book of hymns, for instance. And sometimes you get fully confused that, oh, is it the same epistemologist who is just surrendering here in as if, who is he? These seem to be like, bipolar personalities, as if. We can observe how the same Utpaladeva, who is using logical epistemological language in what I said, Ishvara Pratyabhijna Karika and commentaries, is also writing lucid, delightful and juicy devotional poems in the Shivastotravali, revealing the essence of the teachings of non-dual Shaivism. This is further pointed out by Raffaele Torella in his translation of the following 3 verses from the Shivastotravali. So while I do that, I am also serving the purpose of developing this quotidian metaphysics. Now mark the language, for instance, of the 3 verses that I have tried to quote here. I mean, these are not my translations, Torella's translations. First, dwelling in the midst of the sea of the supreme ambrosia, with my mind immersed solely in the worship of you. Now we'll complicate the worship idea, we haven't done that yet. Immersed solely in the worship of you, may I, so there is a play of you and I, the subject and object. May I attend to all the common occupations of man obviously here, savoring the ineffable in everything. No? So I should be complete, but also may I attend at the same time all the common occupations of human, what I do, Jagat Vyapar. No? Second, may I desire for the objects of the senses be intense. It is not Nivritti Marga, that senses are to be shunned. It is a pravritti marga, according to him, that, oh, you satisfy your senses. They are, why? Because they are deities. He would say that. May my desire for the objects of the senses be intense, O blessed one, like that of all other men. But may I see them as though they were my own body. You project on body. As if they are my own body, with the thought of differentiation gone. Third, may I aspire to liberation. Of course, such a logical motive is there, except every Chavaka. May I aspire to liberation by worshipping you without withdrawing from experience and the world. No withdrawal from the world. And without even seeking the dominion of the extraordinary powers, but becoming intoxicated with the abundant liquor of devotion. Unquote. We note here that the empirical reality or this world of our daily experience is not something that these non-dual Shaiva philosophers encourage us to abandon or develop detachment towards. They do not teach us to cultivate a gradual disgust towards our corporeal existence in the empirical sphere. Quite contrary to this, the quotidian life is real for these non-dual masters, and therefore it cannot be disregarded or abhorred. Instead, it is to be celebrated. I have this another paper which is yet to be done on Utsava. No? For him it is jubilation. For him the existence is that he develops, not only in his tantric works but also in Abhinavagupta, that is his commentary on the Natya. He develops those ideas there. That how you see the existence, not life per se, but existence, the being of it, nothing but the festivity, the Parvan that he calls, the Utsava. It is to be celebrated because it is intrinsically real, intrinsically in italics. The non-dual Shaiva Bhakti is two-pronged, quotidian and not non-quotidian but meta-quotidian. Yet its hallmark is purely non-dual. It is essential to mark the indistinguishable import that non-dual Shaivism offers to both mind and spirit and matter and body. The body is qualified as an abode of Deva and Devi, where they have to be worshipped. Here, this same ordinary world represented by the quotidian or the empirical existence can also be the liberator. Even the body is liberated. Right? Kayopi mokshayate. Pains turn into pleasures. No? Dukkhani api sukhayanti. And poison also becomes ambrosia. Vishamapi amritayate. The senses, that is to say indriyas of the body, are the deities who are to be worshipped by satisfying them. Abhinava prays to these deities in his Devastha Devata Stotra. He also prays to the body of the goddess that is made of language in the Shiva Shakti Abhinavabhava Stotra, quoted in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, the Gita Sangra. This is nice, so I am giving my translation of this. O Mother, if your body is consisting of all words as tradition states, then how is your praise not possible? I can see you connected to all forms, whether born in mind or manifesting outside. Contemplating thus, O you that are benevolent in the world in which inauspiciousness is quenched, the following marvel arises without effort, namely that for me there is not even a single moment that is bereft of praise, repetition, ritual offering and meditation. Because for him, even doing morning regular ritual, you go to washroom and so on and so forth, pure prayer, until and unless you realize it, what it is. No? So, then you have to ask the question, what is the validity of, let's say, a sacred space, for instance. In other words, merely experiencing the ordinary corporeal existence of our own life is worshipping the goddess. The underlying current in the philosophical fineness of Abhinavagupta is this non-dual bhakti, which, besides being firmly fixed in subjective awareness, is also rooted in the altruism of servitude. This servitude is the devotion of the devotee, the self, to the devoted, the other. It is like seeing one's own reflection in a mirror that seems to be the other, but is the self. It is like feeling the other's heart or emotion as one's own and experiencing the other's pain and pleasure as one's own. It is like falling in love with one's own reflection, nor like narcissist, where one conceives of others as the reflected form of one's own self, cognized in the pure heart of the compassionate subject. It is an intimate phenomenological conversation between the subject and the object, and that phenomenological conversation is meant that sambandha, sambandhe savadhanata idea, that your attention is in that the synthesis of it. It is an intimate phenomenological conversation between the subject and the object. The subject recognizes one's own true nature in the object. This is me, right? This is the worship. This is the worship. Abhinava's Grandmaster Utpala claims in the very first verse of the Ishvara Prativijna Karika that attaining the servitude of the Absolute and desiring to serve all humanity go hand in hand. In the teaching of the Malini Vijattara Tantra, which is one of the core sources, to have a firm rooted devotion in Rudra is taught to be the first sign of a guru seeking absorption in the power of Rudra. That's more technical, but we can leave that. One of the foremost teachings in the philosophy of Abhinavagupta is interpreting external physical worship as an expression of cognitive or mental worship. How can we eulogize an insentient stone instead of a sentient self? He is so strong in when he uses that expression. A stone cannot be defined by another stone, but a self can be defined by another self, a reflective self, a self that can absorb into itself the feelings and emotions of the other. So, mental worship has a higher status in Abhinava than physical worship. For instance, he would say, I think one of his commentators very strongly put it in a commentary to his Tantra Loka. Yeah, this Hridaya Geha Bhavatam. This is translation. It can only be a stupid fellow who abandons the universally present all-knowing Shiva who resides in the abode of the cavern of the heart. Understand the absolute self. Not out there. Then, with the aim of worshipping Shiva, he, understand the stupid fellow, worships what is not Shiva, Ashiva. Right? And what is that Ashiva? Is the stone. Right? Which is totally unworthy of eulogizing. So he makes this distinction. The stone you are worshipping is Ashiva. He is creating another category. It can only be stupid fellow who abandons the universally present all-knowing Shiva who resides in the abode of the cavern of the heart, i.e. the absolute self. Then with the aim of worshipping Shiva, he, understand the stupid fellow, worships what is not Shiva at all, a linga, i.e. a stone, etc., which is totally unworthy of eulogizing. Unquote. In the above verse, the implicit and subtly provocative sense is that external worship should be the manifestation of inner devotion. Abhinava does not forbid external ritual practices, albeit these are prescribed for practitioners who may not be able to follow the noetic path. However, the only problem is that if the practitioners limit themselves to the external manifestation of their inner devotion, then it turns out to be an empty action. No? A kriya which is almost a kriya, or an action which is almost a kriya, no? Bereft of action. That does not correspond to any real devotion. Still, an elevated practitioner's journey is the journey of freedom. Freedom to traverse from outside the subjective awareness to inside, and from inside the subjective awareness to outside, from the quotidian world to the meta-quotidian world and back, where eventually the duality of inner and outer manifestation as the unity between the inner and outer, where eventually the duality of inner and outer manifests as the unity between the inner and outer. You see, this inner and outer again is the idea of synthesizing. No? Between this and this, what you're trying to see them as two binary opposite categories, but what is actually happening is it is synthesizing, right? I mean, this inner and outer is rooted in that synthesis, right? It is the freedom of the free subject that allows you to enjoy my servitude and your freedom to relish my plenitude of devotion. It is this interdependence that is being with the capital B. It is not self-surrender or stooping. Instead, it is the enjoyment generated between the dynamic relationship of the enjoyer and the enjoyed, or the server and the served. In English, I have limitation of using the terms, but in Sanskrit there would be better terms. With this, the equanimity between the two is focused upon, which emerges as the non-dual devotion. In his own words, Abhinava states something similar in the Anuttarashtika, another of his stotras. Concerning this supreme reality, the beatitude is not like the excitement derived from wealth and liquor and so on and so forth. The rising of the light of consciousness has nothing to do with the rays of light emanating from a lamp, the sun and the moon. The joy is the happiness of freedom from differentiation accumulated for a long time, similar to putting one's burden on the floor. The manifesting of light is the attainment of the state of non-duality of everything, of a forgotten treasure. Unquote. The beatitude that generates the excitement for the attainment of the state of non-duality is a phenomenon of pure joy. Now I'm trying to interpret it. You see, I'm trying to develop that hermeneutics. And this joy is attained when both physical and mental emerge simultaneously in the purest form of nothing but a ruminating experience. If this is the case, if this has to be the case, then asks Abhinavagupta in one of his own stotras, Mahopadesha Vimshatika, why is an elevated practitioner required to perform a physical ritual? And the answer is given there in the scene. Why does a pure person need an ablution then? And why does someone who is, because if you say you are pure, then you shouldn't take bath. Right? What does bath do? There is another example. For instance, I think I am quoting that somewhere. So if ablution gives you moksha, what about fish or tortoise? Their whole life is in water. They are all the time taking bath, right? Why? Then there should be no fish in the whole cosmos, because they have all got moksha. All fish has gotten moksha because it has always taken bath. So why is that not the case? That's kind of one argument even. Why does a pure person need an ablution? And why does someone who is cladding everything need clothes? Why does someone who is well smeared need fragrance? Why does a beautiful person need ornaments? Rhetorical questions, no? Unquote. In a corporeal reality, a body needs a physical ablution to keep it clean. A metaphysical ablution, on the other hand, perfects the maculate nature of the mind. The physical and metaphysical have to function together coherently in his system, as do quotidian and meta-quotidian realities. However, both quotidian and meta-quotidian are brought to be scrutinized by the Shastric rigor. That's also his position. But without compromising its functional purposefulness. Even if the physical ritual bears the efficacy of managing empirical afflictions, the noetic ritual is favored by Abhinavagupta. In his famous Bhairava Stotra, he says, O Shiva, the following is true. Austerity like vrata, donation, dana, ablution, snana, and penance, tapas, help get away from worldly afflictions. But the contentment of the supreme ambrosia of your Shastra trickles the stream of beatitude in consciousness. That is the idea of uh, inserting that eagle eye almost into questioning these ideas also at the same time, because questioning makes it even firm, right? The position, right? In the commentary on this verse, Jayartha explicates a possible question, and I think this is what I was just saying some time back. He says, if the liberation is possible because of bathing in water, then why fish do not have it? Right? Merely being in the water, now that is unquote, merely being in the water repeatedly does not prevent anyone from achieving their soteriological motive. One has to bring the inner and outer together, synthesizing again, right? One has to touch the sensitive chord in conjunction with the two. Worshipping stones outside is worthless if that is all that a practitioner is devoted to. One should worship the inner linga and not the outside linga, he says. Unquote. One should worship the union of the inner and the outer, the union of the mind and body. There is no escape for duality in there. In other words, physical action without the corresponding awareness is useless. Instead, if there is awareness, physical ritual action could even be unnecessary. Every action would then become a ritual, right? My writing, my anything, you mean it, anything. External rituals are needed for beginners, but advanced yogis means in his case anyone who can visualize that idea. And even Jivan Muktas, the external devotion with rituals, yoga, etc. is for the latter only for the sake of expressing devotion, which entails duality. Devotion needs duality, at least at a superficial level. However, advanced practitioners are warned to be aware that this dualism is only functional. That is why Abhinav claims in one of his stotras, Mahopadesha Vimshatika, he says, and I read my translation, it is because of relishing the taste of your devotion that we talk about duality, of worshipping and worshipper, etc. Stop doing that now. One should not be ashamed to say that all this is one and tranquil. That is to say, the worshipper and the worshipped is one. Right? Now, here onwards, I have elaborative sections of further. If you whatever you would suggest.
Maybe if you want 2-3 minutes break.
No, I don't want any break.
Okay.
I'm fine. I can complete rather this section and.
Any question up to now? Maybe after
Yeah,
we'll have
He's actually going through his presentation. He's unfolding it. I think at the end we'll take it.
Yeah,
Because
we'll
we're still unfolding it.
Yeah.
As you like it. I'm all fine. With anything.
Okay.
We'll go ahead. Okay. Now I slightly, because again these categories became important. So merely saying non-dual devotion, what does that non-duality mean? So I'm trying to slightly focus on that idea. For Abhinavagupta, duality complements non-duality, i.e. duality rests in the tranquil nature of non-duality. This reposing, what you would call Vishranti, is a phenomenon that is not said or reasoned, not by yuktya, not by yukti, or argued for. Its being is that it is experienced or felt. It is experienced in the relationship of the subject and the object. I and you, where both become one. In the words of Abhinava, again I think it is that Mahopadesha Vimshatika. So mark here the very play of what he plays with the grammatical tenses here. which in some of his books he has elaborated and so on and so forth. So his idea would be simply that you as a pronoun, no, second person becomes manifest out of I. So I am addressing, if I address someone, I say you. Now mark also this reflectiveness of the you when I say to sir, you. Sir doesn't understand it you, because if he understood as you, literal meaning, it would be a regress. Then it will become you. Whenever I say you, are you fine? He says, I am fine. He automatically translates that you into I. Because that's meant to be there. Because that is his I. So you turns into its opposite, the reflective. No? In dualism, this is the verse, and I'm quoting, my own translation. In dualism, or in dualistic devotion, you indeed are me, I indeed am I. We are entirely separate and you alone are real, and I am not real at all. Instead, in true devotion, or non-dual devotion, I bow to that reality, namely being, where both you and me are not. Understand, by that not is also meant existence. No? Now, unquote, the worldly transaction is only possible between mutually opposing categories. For instance, the category I is naturally opposed to the category you at the empirical level. And in the category I, the category you is evidently absent. However, our world could be described as a play of presencing and absencing. Every time, everything that is manifest to us in its presence is also manifest to us in its absence. There is a mutual and constant tension between the presencing and absencing. It is like knowledge entailing ignorance and ignorance entailing knowledge. I entailing you and you entailing I. Existence, namely worldly experience, is only possible in the relationship between these two mutual binaries. That's why the mutual binary is important for him. That's why Bheda is not unimportant for him, because Advaita means bringing Bheda and Abheda together. That is, if I use the term Mahadvaita for instance, if that helps, right? Existence, namely worldly experience, is only possible in the relationship between these two mutual binaries. But understanding this relationship means, paradoxically, annihilating the distinction between the two, i.e., annihilating the distinction between the subject and the object. The fundamental philosophical stake of Abhinavagupta is to claim the non-dual nature of the nature of everything, this idea of sarvam sarvatmaka. Developing an argument for non-duality can be a challenging philosophical exercise, especially when Abhinava is active across heterogeneous tantric textual traditions. Despite this, all his texts establish an argumentative rubric for developing a smooth path ahead for the oneness or the sameness of Pramata, Prameya and Praman. Abhinava advances this oneness or non-dual hermeneutics across the texts he has composed or commented on. He creates a meta-category in every context that strikes a harmonious balance between empirical and transcendental realities, between what I call quotidian and meta-quotidian. Because transcendental for him is not, you start looking up there and that is the intervention or sort of divine intervention. No. Our empirical experience is explained by duality or multiplicity. But this duality is interrelated to unity or oneness in the same way as unity is interdependent on duality or multiplicity. It is this opposite of binaries, as mentioned above, that Abhinava is addressing, creating a meta-category of supreme non-duality, Paramatvaitava, where both one and many coexist mutually and amicably reposing in each other. Now that's fundamentally reposing in the sense literally saying resting in each other. And those of you who may be interested in the aesthetic world, then you have to understand somewhere the whole idea of the rasa, the aesthetic experience of tranquility, is rooted in this notion, right? So, creating a meta-category of supreme non-duality where both one and many coexist mutually and amicably, reposing in each other. Thus, a category like means without means, what I invoked in the very beginning, anupaya, which otherwise sounds like an oxymoron and therefore non-existence, is like the highest state of being. And this philosophical fineness of Abhinavagupta is evinced in Anuttarashtika, where you would see what he is trying to do. There is no spiritual, he's like Upanishadic ideas, where you have the positive and the negative language, for instance. This is one of the verses, and in my translation, there is no spiritual progress, no creative meditation, no employment of stories. This is not Nagarjunian model, no employment of stories or discourses, no inquiry, no absorption, no concentration, no repeated mantric recitations, and no effort. Then explain to me what is well ascertained, supreme and true. Listen, whatever your condition is, now look at from one side the banality of it. Listen, whatever your condition is, without abandoning and without acquiring, and I was translating that into that idea of presencing and absencing, without abandoning and without acquiring, enjoy everything happily. Now, that if you bring a certain essentialist interpretation of this, it will be like, yeah, okay, well, I mean, my mother says that to me every day, so what do you mean by this, Unquote. The above verse teaches effortlessness. Therefore, the instruction is in the language of negations. And this effortlessness is further exemplified by non-abandoning and non-acquiring. This paradox of abandoning or acquiring gradually moves towards developing some dialectical unity of opposites. However, this dialectical unity is not dichotomous, but circular. It is as if, like the Oroboro, one end of the circle is the subject and the other is the object. And there is constantly revolving and moving from the positions of the subject to the object and object to the subject. That idea of, you have seen that in many of these symbols where you have a round snake, a snake has the tail in its own mouth. So that round symbol, which is in many also, I think Theosophical Society probably has that. That is what I mean, like an Oroboro, one end of the circle is the subject and other is the object, and there is constantly revolving and moving from the positions of the subject to object and object to subject. I can explain this later if it is complicated. Still, this process is not unidirectional, and this phenomenon is dynamic. The absolute dynamic subject is the one who is unique, is internal to lights and also to darkness, and in which there is lights and darkness. It is the very essence of all entities. I am translating here from one of another stotras, the Bhagavatam. Light and darkness, now this is unquote, after that, light and darkness, even though mutually opposite categories, residing in the absence of each other, that's a logical postulation, right, are also mutually interdependent, paradoxically, through their absence. There is an eternal identity, nityatadatmya, between power and power possessor, the Shakti and Shaktiman or Shaktimat. And this relationship is like between heat and fire. Heat is the very nature of fire. Fire means heat. In this dialectical circular unity, abandoning or agreeing becomes mere two potent possibilities depending on which side of the circle one is on. Or they are mere potentially contemplative states of mind. Now, I have this one again, Anuttarashtika quotation here, but I think I can move ahead with mine. This is why Abhinava teaches, whatever is your condition, live in peace. Do not reject anything or do not grasp anything. Which is the core of his philosophical creativity introduced through the concept of means without means. This also signifies that the idea of subjectivity and objectivity, or presencing and withdrawing, is dynamic and not absolutely fixed in Abhinava's non-dual view. This is similar to a cognitive process, and this is what I think I mentioned, wherein the knower, the pramata, the known prameya, and the valid means of knowledge, pramana, could be located anywhere in this circular process of knowledge. Still, their internal sequence, the pramanic sequence, has to follow from knower to known via valid means, and at the same time it also has to follow the sequence from the knower to the known. So earlier was known to knower, now this is knower to known via valid means. It is nothing less and nothing more, to paraphrase one of his another works. There is only totality of everything. So as he says in one of his another stotras. But I believe that is the sphere of duality when all things are distinct in their own specific nature. The word non-dual will automatically give rise to dualism. So he has no problem with dualism per se, unquote. This suggests that duality and non-duality manifest as unitarily equiposing the substratum of reflective awareness. This substratum is in his language what he calls Bhairava. When manifesting in the form of Devi, it is restlessly engaged in becoming aware of her own nature, and it is through this Devi that Deva is restlessly engaging in enjoying the play of the world. This is his unsurpassed, challenging activity, which is nothing but freedom, the lordliness, the nature of consciousness. Now this is something, of course, because I'm partly also paraphrasing the translations, but if one has to write a purely without translations and philosophical essay, the idea is, you see, in one of his works, this Parakrishika Vivarana, for instance, he uses interpretations of this one concept, one word, idea, Deva. Deva means, why is Deva Deva? Why is Deva, let's say Deva, not called Deva. No? And he takes recourse, as you see in deep philosophy, mostly they take recourse, for instance, to geometry for explaining things. Here they always go back to Panini, the grammarian, explaining things either through etymology, which I see in Western philosophy. I mean, Heidegger, wow, I mean, those just going back again to the root, no? Russell does, So he's going to Panini and trying to invoke his Dhatu Partha, saying, okay, what is the verbal root for Divu Deva? And then he quotes all the meanings there, Devu Krida, Vijigisha, and so on and so forth, and gives meaning to each of them. So it means also Krida, it means also play. It means also shining forth, the whole Abhasavada, the whole this manifestation theory, and so on and so forth. And how does Deva manifest? Deva manifests in Devi. No? Right? So you have the Prakasha, and the state of being in Prakasha is Devi. And Prakasha is Deva. Undetachable. You can't say that light and luminosity is different. No, you can't. Luminosity is the active nature of light. In terms, if I ask you in this room, where is luminosity? Light you may still point out. You may say, oh, this is the origin of light. We don't mean that. There is no way you can segregate or apart the idea of, in his language, the prakasha and vimarsha, the light and reflective awareness. These are usually the translations. And that's why they reside in each other. This is a play between the subject and object. So when is it that prakasha becomes subject and the vimarsha becomes the object? And when is it that, so it's like something, for instance, defining, when is it that with relationship to this empirical reality, I am the subject in relation, and this is objectified reality. Now turning the tables upside down, when is it that this empirical reality becomes subject? And I become an objectified reality within this subjective existence. So where the world, as in when I say world, I mean loka, I mean jagat, no? Jagat vyavahar. Whereas in empirical world itself becomes subject. So when Devi becomes subject. Now we often of course get, either we understand, their connotation of how we understand in South Asian case every day. There might be even 100 people around whose name is Deva and whose name is Devi and so on and so forth in South Asian case. But the whole point is that, somebody's name Prakash, somebody's name Vimarsha and so on and so forth. Do pay attention. It's all about, from one point of view, what Ganesh would say, attention, not self, title of his book. I think this section I will end here, then I have to go ahead. Maybe, do I have time to go ahead or? Okay, 5-10 minutes. Do I see this section finishing? Okay, I will.
Yeah, we had a deep break, but we are just going straight. Yeah, so
Okay, by 1:30. I hope I have enough time, but I'll try to be, let's say, fast.
But sir, please give time for questions.
questions and answer, yeah.
Yes, that is the same relationship. Thanks for bringing in question. That is the same relationship. I and you, subject and object, Deva and Devi, it is Prashna and Uttara. Prashna taduttara rupa Devi, he would say in Paratrishika Vivaram. That is the relationship of the question and answer. This, what he is defining here, that's the hermeneutics. Now, little bit focus on, I think, I want to see if I can skip that and go to the, I think I'll skip the light. There is a small section on light and luminosity, but I think I'll skip that because I have given, I think, some idea of that. So with that background, which I hope was not confusing, let's go ahead and inquire this idea of stuti, the form of devotion. Let us now ask the fundamental question. What is a stotra or a stuti? For him, from his point of view, do stotras teach philosophy, or do they map the literary tropes, or are they only meant to satiate the spiritual quest of compassionate devotees, or are they only praise and portrayal of exalted characteristics of gods and goddesses? Sometimes simply compiling their 1,000 names, if you have this Sahasranama idea. Are they mere hymnal prayers, the hymn ideas? Or do they have their distinct voice to which we are deaf? Or where does the importance of a stotra lie? What is the purpose of composing stotras? For elaborate discussion investigating such questions, close scrutiny and perhaps a more extended monograph might be a desideratum. We have already mentioned that Hamsastenian's poetry and prayer in the Sanskrit hymns of Kashmir has done some justice to this theme. As far as philosophical stotras are concerned, a few observations may help reflect these questions further. See here, for students, for instance, this becomes important. I think this is something very important in Indian philosophical circles, classical or even modern and so on and so forth, that whatever the idea of, let's say, to use the simple word, whatever it signifies, poetry or literariness or literary trend, we are so shameless that because we have this published book by Penguin, and in the last page it says, okay, let's say teachings of Kabir. Let's take one example. And the last corner somewhere it says literature. It goes to the stack of literature. And of course we are not unaware of the arrogance of philosophers who would say that, well, this is not philosophy. Is Kabir doing philosophy, for instance? No. Now from one point of view it's complicated because of course he is not writing a Nyaya text, he is not writing Sankhya Karika, Tarka Sangraha and so on and so forth. And he is not talking philosophy from that point of view, how logic, rationality and so on and so forth, oh I have to prove it. So it becomes very difficult to engage with them philosophically. What do I mean by that? And that hasn't happened enough shamelessly for all of us, I think in the South Asian paradigm. One is that you pick up Nyaya Sutra and you are doing philosophy your safer side. No, nobody will challenge and say that, is this philosophy or philosophy enough? Now you pick up, I go extreme, just to exaggerate the example. I go extreme. I tell students that the day you are able to pick up a washing machine manual and philosophize it, then soteriological motive, kaivalya, nirvana, moksha, whatever, that's done. Because reading philosophical texts is one thing, but to read a text or rather any text philosophically should be the art, right? So to simply say that stotras don't teach philosophy or anything for that matter, no. But are we doing a philosophical scrutiny? Are we culling out the philosophical ideas from wherever they are discussed in whatever literature? So are we equipped enough to do that at the first place? No? By merely just using bhava and abhava, saying that there is absence of philosophy in it, is not enough. So, going ahead, now I'm here beginning with the translation of one of the stotra verses in the stotra. Why? Look at this idea that everything he is just not taking for granted. You know? He is asking, why should a stotra be composed? And in many of, like for instance in Tantra Loka, at one place in the beginning where there is this long introductory chapter to the 37 long 12 volumes, he asks a question. Why should a question be asked? Him in Sanskrit, what? So he would say, what is the nature of what? Second what in quotes. First let us try to understand when we ask what does it mean to ask what? Kim iti asya kim lakshanam. What does it mean when we say what? Are we clear about that first? Right? So here, kind of, why should a stotra be composed? Asks Abhinavagupta in the Krama stotra. If the variegated activity of the great Lord, whose many powers manifest the lordliness of the abundance of the worldly existence, reside in the heart of the stotru, like one who composes a stotra. If it is there, then why should be a stotra composed? No? But if it is composed anyway, then by means of the stotra, suddenly the bowing to Shiva becomes the foremost means to the attainment of identity with him. Unquote. If we ask what bowing to Shiva means, then another set of questions that should concern us is, who is the self or the praiser? I am translating stota here as the praiser. What qualifies one to be a praiser, stotru? What does it mean to worship? Abhinava's concept of worship is not confined to Shiva or Shaivism alone. He would say that worship is in all traditions means turning multiplicity to unity. For instance, even in the Vaishnava tradition, Bhagavadotpala, the author of Spanda Pradipika, briefly engages with this problem by emphasizing that, now this is the translation of his one small comment there. What does he say? Praise is nothing but absorption into its own nature. Swaswarupa Amarshana. What is meant here is the non-duality of the praiser, praise, and the praised. No? Right? Three of them. We have praiser, one who praises. We have the praise, the stotra, and what is being praised. Like exactly the epistemic pramata, prameya, pramata. No? Through the means. So stotra is a means. No. Otherwise, if that is not the case, so it's Bhagavad Utpala in another tradition. Praise is nothing but absorption into its own nature. What is meant here is the non-duality of the praiser, praise, and the praised. Otherwise, who is the one who praises? Who is being praised? And what is praise anyway? And in another Vaishnava text, what I gave this Vishnu Sahasranama Stotra, look at now the idea. This is Vishnu is defined also as Stavya, Stavapriya, Stotra, Stuti, Stota, and the commentator Shankara points out that Vishnu is all of these, including the prayer. Stota apitsa eva. Who is the self? The meaning of worshipping is eventually recognizing the self. A similar idea resonates in Abhinavagupta's direct pupil Kshemaraja's Bhairavanaka Naskarana Stotra and in a verse of the Samba Panchashi. What does it say? I'm paraphrasing that. The one who praises, who is being praised, and the praise are respectively translated, what I just said, as agent, object, and action. I.e., they are the worshipper, worshipped, and worshipped. An anonymous verse quoted in the Paratrishika Vivarna identifies the Stuti as the Lord Himself. I.e., translation, there is nothing called Stuti that is different from the all-pervading great Lord. Stuti is certainly the realization of, here he is saying, I am Shiva. Like, in Vedantic case you can say, Aham Brahmasmi. But they are metaphysically very different categories. In fact, Abhinava's own bold claim in the Anuttarashtika is, and one line that I am translating, discourse based on the differentiation of worship, worshipper, and worshipped can be done, all emphasizing the unitariness of the process, which is dynamic. Unquote. As we discuss these questions, we also learn that for Abhinava, these praise poems represent the act of worshipping or celebrating. Even the act of worshipping becomes worthy of venerating as he claims to attribute it to his grand teacher Utpala. And then there is this one quotation. In other words, there is nothing that is not the worship of Shiva. Any daily common act, including eating, running, thinking, defecating, procreating, etc., is worshipping Shiva. Self-recognition is worshipping Shiva, i.e., it is an act of self-recognition. It is effortless, but it is a self-reflective state of mind, as Abhinava reiterates in the Krama Stotra. Just one caution, it's not caution, but I think, when in the South Asian system we invoke these categories, the time I say subject and object and I translate that into Shiva and Shakti, our mind, by a certain cultural affiliation, goes immediately to what I simply would tell you is Raja Ravi Verma's calendar art. No? The first image that comes to you when I utter the word, let's say Shiva, for instance, what comes to your in front of, whether it is determinate perception or indeterminate perception, or it is mind-born reality, the first thing comes to your mind is calendar art, like the image that is there in calendars and such. But it's very hard. It's a tapas. It's a hard exercise to undo that, because while I would say that's what also it may mean, but that calendar art, a form, and so on, from Puranas and there is much complex. Here we are purely talking of an ontological category. So to think of when they give you a certain ontological or even cosmological map of 36 ontic realities, like Sankhya model, no? 25, so they add 11 more to that, right? So the creative, philosophical creative play, elaborating the ontology. So they are like, okay, we are not satisfied with your model, we accept your model of 25, but I think we have to add 11 more. I mean, interestingly, those 11 also in their cosmology are not their own. We borrow them from earlier dualists, the dualist Shaiva systems. And they try to interpret them something completely different. Now there, if you map where is Shiva, Sadashiva, Paramashiva, where is Shakti, what is it? Exactly in the Sankhyan way, no? How you map ideas. These are ontological categories, so you should be very, very careful, when you invoke them. So that's just a footnote. That's for students. It is effortlessness, but it is effortless, but it is a self-reflective state of mind, as Abhinava reiterates in the Krama Stotra, one of his stotras. He says, having reflected upon oneself, the praiser, the one stota, the one who praises, reflects once again on the deeds of the Venerable One. In this way, the one who praises exhibits the differentiation of oneself in the praise, the stotra, the object of which is differentiation. And the self is reflected at the time of knowing the complete set of entities. This complete set of entities is that Shaktam Shattattviya idea, the 36 tattvas, the ontic realities. Therefore, in this way, here is your stotra. Here, in your stotra, I am constantly effortless. Unquote. Worshipping means constant effortlessness, i.e. reflecting on oneself constantly. In the Krama context, in the Tantra Loka, this act of worshipping is defined by Abhinavagupta as follows. This is my translation. What we call worship is the identification of the differentiated stream of entities with the self-consciousness that is autonomous, untainted and infinite. Unquote. When the differentiated nature of manyness is realized to be or identified with the unitary nature of oneness, this is what Abhinavagupta calls worship. For instance, when I play cricket in a playground or dance in a party, I focus fully on either playing or dancing, i.e. the multiplicity of actions, thoughts and so on, and the effort I put in there turn into their opposite, multiplicity. And this multiplicity becomes unity and effort turns into effortlessness. And the performance of the act becomes perfect. That's why that perfect idea is that the purity idea, the perfect devotion. No? This effortless act of perfection is an act of enjoying oneself. Ask a performer, a real performer. Thus, in Abhinavan terms, it also means worshipping oneself. This intense efficacy of one's own worship bears the power of turning sacred into profane and profane into sacred. Whatever delights the mind, as he would say, and wherever it relishes is worship. This quotation, whatever pleases the mind in whatever sphere of the senses is fit for the real luminous abode of Absolute and is indeed an instrument of worship. Unquote. This real and luminous abode of existence that fundamentally constitutes the antinomonious existence of the mutually opposing categories like real and unreal, less and more, eternal and non-eternal and so on, is constantly present. To become aware of this luminous and everlasting nature of consciousness, which can be directly experienced by means of whatever thing, in whatever activity, at any time, is an antidote to becoming the victim of the above mentioned pairs, the binaries. In Anuttarashtika, Abhinava emphasizes this, and this is the translation of that quotation. After having understood that whatever reflects in the mirror of consciousness, be it real or unreal, less or more, eternal or non-eternal, stained by illusion or pure in itself, consists in a manifestation of forms by means of the arising of one's own awareness. That is to say, consciousness. Let you, who are aware of your greatness, enjoy the universal godliness. Now I'll have just a couple of pages of last. Will that be fine? I think I'll bring that to end now. Because the last point, sorry for that. Because the last point I have to summarize is what does the quotidian metaphysics mean? How does this whole debate on devotion and so on and so forth, the quotidianness of it, I will do in just a couple of pages. Our next focus is the category of the quotidian that he calls janasthiti, the state of the being of the common lot. Because it is the quotidian that is the litmus test of the tantric theory of the absolute, which I said earlier. The quotidian is the realm of action and the dynamism of the power of action that is only possible in the efficacious potentiality of the quotidian. An act of cooking all the rice in the whole universe is not possible, i.e. a category like universal riceness cannot be cooked. An act of cooking is possible only with respect to a particular amount of rice. It is only possible in the realm of particularity. The dynamism of the manifestation of the absolute is only possible in the realm of the quotidian. But the empirical realm implies plurality, i.e. the binary and non-dual and the binary and not non-duality. It means encountering, for example, the binary of mutually opposing categories such as purity and impurity, for instance, which I have been emphasizing earlier, but I am focusing on that now. This also involves asking questions about, from Abhinava's point of view, about social purity and impurity. Because if we are talking about the quotidian, we are concerned about that. We can't leave that aside. Abhinava offers meta-meaning to the duality of purity and impurity. He says, i.e., one may worship an impure God through impure means, which a pure or impure God, whatever it be, has to accept then. No? In the Tantra Loka, Abhinava says, and this is the translation, not mine, of Mark Wichkowski, I quote, this union and disjunction. Now, connected that union and disjunction earlier when I used the words like concealing and revealing. No? This union and disjunction of purity and impurity of consciousness is because of the attribute of the knowing subject. Not that when you say, now you see this is something, another realm now. You say this is pure or impure in itself, ontologically pure or impure, right? But with respect to what? Again you go with respect to the subject, the knowing subject. So, knowing a pot and knowing a pure or an impure pot, right? Now, build it on top of that, knowing a pot. Pot is also knowing you. No, pot cannot exist without you knowing the pot. Now think of pot being pure or impure, whatever the categories for philosophical exercise. This union and disjunction of purity and impurity of consciousness is because of the attribute of the knowing subject. Unquote. Nothing is innately pure or impure. But we impose these categories on the phenomenal reality in our subjective awareness. To quote him again, purity and impurity are in the eye of the beholder. In fact, Abhinava's commentator Jayaratha adds, and he says very strongly, this is why purity and impurity are not fixed. No? What is impure for one can be pure for someone else, and vice versa. Unquote. Jayaratha further clarifies, quotation, there is the division of purity and impurity everywhere as a result of union and disjunction with consciousness, depending on if it is one with consciousness, if it is not one with consciousness. It is because of that you think that there is purity and impurity. Unquote. If one is united with consciousness, it is purity. And if one is not, that is impurity. Purity and impurity in themselves are not absolute categories like Shiva and Shakti. Here, Abhinava is creating a robust platform for the pure practice of subjective freedom that is rooted in the non-duality of the metaphysical categories like Shiva and Shakti. Another realm to attach with the idea of what I was explaining as non-dual devotion. Mapping the path of universal sameness, samarasata or the samata, this interpretation of non-duality is unique and philosophically provocative. A few illustrations of how Abhinava treats the categories of qualified or unqualified persons, for instance the idea of patrata, the caste, gastronomic inhabition, incest, etc., that form the core fabric of the quotidian may be useful. Unlike other philosophical systems in South Asia that practiced and prescribed strong and rigid injunctions for qualified or unqualified persons based on their so-called pure or impure background, the system of Abhinava strongly opposes this discriminatory hierarchical bias. That, remember, I was problematizing the discriminator Veda idea earlier, the Veda and Aveda, right? That is where I am just moving towards now to conclude. Unlike other philosophical systems in South Asia that practiced and prescribed strong and rigid injunctions for qualified and unqualified persons based on their so-called pure and impure or impure backgrounds, the system of Abhinavagupta strongly opposes this discriminatory hierarchical bias. Abhinava comments about Jana or an ordinary mortal saying, quote, thus he, understand the commentary that I am writing on Utpaladeva, thus he means to point out that there is no restriction of any kind in this regard to any kind in this regard to the right to follow this system. So, there is no question of the right and not right. Somebody has the right, the adhikara to approach this system. But all you need is just the desire to know. Whosoever realizes the true nature of the self attains the highest goal, because of self-realization is the highest goal and cannot be impeded by anything what is regarded as an impediment. That is the justification for him saying that there is no whosoever, yena kenara, whosoever, unquote. Abhinava further adds to this, saying the word api indicates this identity with the Supreme and precludes the possibility of any other motive in him than the good for others, because he has attained perfection. So someone, see this moksha idea for instance, if you are overflowing yourself with attainment of moksha, then his argument is then nothing is there for you to be done more than, because now the self is overflowing with the selfness. There is only that state of mind how to be compassionate to the other. If that is not the case, then you are still not the self what you are claiming to be. The word api indicates this identity with the Supreme and precludes the possibility of any other motive in him than the good for others, because he has attained perfection. The good of others is also really a motive, because the definition of motive applies to it. There is no divine curse that only one's own good can become a motive and not that of others. Even he is so strong in that language. Even one's own good, if it does not come with the definition, is not a motive at all. Unquote. Utpaladeva begins his Ishvara Prativijñākārika with the concern for an ordinary mortal, and he also concludes that Ishvara Prativijñākārika presenting the same concern on which Abhinavagupta comments, and he says, the translation, The word jana means simply man, understand, human, common. In the following system, therefore, the qualification of belonging to a particular caste, etc. is unnecessary. Right? Hence, it is asserted that it is for the benefit of all. He is very adamantly saying that. Unquote. In his commentary on the Paratrishika Vikarana, Abhinava claims that caste distinction is artificial and that the claim that Brahmins alone can receive the instruments in the scriptures is laughable. He says, the translation of Jayadev Singh, the course of knowledge has been described in detail. Of the castes, Brahmins, etc., there is no fixed principle, for caste distinction is artificial. The specification that Brahmins alone are entitled for instruction can convince only the silly herd. This has been conclusively clarified in detail by the Lord in the Mukuta Samhita or the Mukutarama. In the Trika, in our system, understand he is saying in our system, in his system, it is established without any effort at proving. We don't need to even establish this. This is not something we are interested in. Unquote. The definition of a qualified person is anyone, as Abhinavagupta continues. He also translates his tantric teachings into the concern of social aesthetics. For instance, in the 15th chapter of the Tantraloka, the egalitarian social order is not compromised, since that contradicts the non-dual nature of consciousness. Abhinava deconstructs discriminatory caste hierarchy. Citing significantly early tantric sources or scriptures, he emphatically argues against the discrimination or differentiation based on both caste and food. To illustrate, he teaches that, and I quote, no notion of caste and the like apply to the essential nature of consciousness, as it is not the true nature of its nature. It is capable of obscuring that nature. Unquote. Then quoting the Nishachara Tantra, he designates caste as a great obstacle. He says, the supreme obstacle to liberation. Obstacle here, in the sense he uses the word term demon there. The supreme obstacle to liberation is this demonic attachment to the caste. He says, Ayam jati graha paranirodakaha, which expresses itself in the notion of I am a Brahmin, I am so on and so forth. So how can I dedicate myself to something other than that taught in the Vedic scripture? Unquote. He further cites the teachings of the Mukutagama, saying, again translation, thus the common observances of caste and the like is not taught in these secret scriptures, the Rahasya Shastra, Tantra Shastra, that come from Shiva and teach the true nature of things. Unquote. Caste is demonic and an error. Now he is trying to, like the Vedantin's idea of Shukti Rajata, he's trying to prove it as an error. Right? If caste is demonic and an error, Abhinava voices this concern citing Kulagahvara Tantra. He says a tenacious error, graha, what he calls. It is said to be like a demon that takes possession of people. Unquote. He further contends, alluding to the Ananda Shastra, for instance, and there's a long quotation. He brings in quotations from Mahabharata, for instance, and again his own Paratrishika Vivarana, and so on and so forth. But I think I'll straight go now to the end. I have bored you and you must be tired. But let me go to the end. One paragraph I will still have to read. While deliberating the problem of purity and impurity, a short and pointed argument occurring in the 4th chapter of the Tantraloka, where a question of gastronomic inhibition is invoked. Citing the Veeravari Tantra, Abhinava points out that if the ancient sages also believed in the unitary principle of consciousness, then how is it that in the ancient past the Vedic sages ate beef and human flesh, while it was prohibited by the Vedic scripture? Jayaratha further develops this line of inquiry. He says, and I am quoting, If ancient sages had not known that the purity of the sacrificial substance, dravya, is their oneness with the consciousness, how is it that they could eat beef and the like, which is contrary to common practice, the loka practice, and has been banned by the scriptures? He's referring to the smritis, for instance, the dharma shastric literature. Unquote. In response to this question, Jayartha again quotes a verse, most probably from the Veeravali Tantra itself, that says, in translation, the sacrificial substance which obnoxious and censored is abhorred by the common man, the loka, and is banned by the scriptures, should be eaten by the heroes. He has a certain concept that he develops of the Veeras. The Veera who is the best of the yogis for him, for instance. Because then you are inhabited in your action. Inhibition is there in your action, which means that you are not adhering to the principle of non-duality. Right? That's what he means to say. An injunction is prescribed for the seeker of non-duality that they should not practice any inhibition at all. Otherwise, it may harm the very notion of non-duality. Transgression is possible of something that is prohibited, not of something that is prescribed. It is the purity of consciousness that is emphasized. But more than that, overcoming inhibition of something that social norm deem odious. It is like savoring the unsavory and also enjoying it blissfully. This is why Jayartha affirms, and this is then the Jayartha's quotation here. Now, I'll just conclude with this one more line from Alexis Sanderson's one quotation, which is just trying to wrap up the idea from why is it that this transgression itself is seen as transcendence. It is this transgression, as Alexis Sanderson would say, it is this transgression also, as Alexis also maintains on the basis of the Ananda Tantra, which I just quoted above, that translates into transcendence. He quotes from the Ananda Tantra saying, the very substances, now that's something very important, no? This is what I was trying to say in the latter half of the essay. The very substances which are said to be the cause of a man's downfall into the in the Vedic religion become the means of accelerating his liberation in this system of the left, the Vama Charana, the Vama Charya. So how is it that the transgression, is translated into transcendence, and the means of the same, means of achieving it are the same exactly? Now, final conclusion. What translates from transgression to transcendence is the potentiality of the non-dual bhakti for Abhinavagupta. In his system, the two mutually opposing categories not only come together but also create a mutually harmonizing synthesis of binary opposites, right? Whatever I pointed out so far. Now I'm trying to, it may be a lip service, I haven't thought much about it, but while the invitation came from the department, I started thinking of Ramachandra Dattatreya Ranade's some very, rather original philosophical ideas. Not all, of course, but the way he uses this idea of rational mysticism, which is again an oxymoron, binary opposite, rational mysticism. So it's not, of course, a deep thought in that, but I'm just, as a tribute, I think, concluding with that. In his system, that is to say Abhinavagupta's system, the mutually opposing categories not only come together but also create a mutually harmonizing synthesis of binary opposites, like what Ramachandra Dattatreya Ranade has called rational mysticism. That is, and he says, the experience acceptable to the reason, as Ranade calls it, and he says further, which is not a contradiction in terms but a truism. He uses that term, which is a truism. It's not a contradiction, but a truism. As he would say in the preface of his famous book, A Constructive Survey of Upanishadic Philosophy. Abhinavagupta's Quotidian Metaphysics and Ranade's Rational Mysticism are the answers to my dear anonymous colleague with who I mentioned in the beginning of this paper, and with whom I must conclude this paper. It is like you worship your own enemy in your own heart without killing him. This is the truism of rational mysticism. So I conclude with that. Sorry for holding you for too long.
It's very deep, very deep and very illustrious as well. Thank you so much. Can we take one or two questions? No, but then the prof may not be there. Let's just take one or two. No, but then that's not good. Let's just take some. Yeah, we can take one. Because after lunch, people might run over. So let's just.
So the first thing is that you mentioned, so by the way, it was a great, very deep, as man said, presentation, but one of the first things that you talked about was, you talked about the worship of Shakti, in a very opening statement you talked about, which was quite interesting. Then you talked about the worship of Shiva in the heart, right, which is, to me, a little confusing, but let me continue. Inner and outer, when you compare that to the mind and body, because again, sort of confusion, because there's Shakti, there's Shiva, then there's inner and outer, and then there's mind and body. Then there's the relationship of one and object, that I cannot relate that to the others. And then you went on to the play of the Dev and Dev, right? And then you talked about freedom. So these were some key points that I tried to connect. You're not trying to connect the dots. There were other things that you mentioned, but they were quite deep actually. And then I looked into obviously the whole overlaying of Tantra. So so I wanted to try and connect all of that together. So I don't think it was enough.
See, the fundamental, should I take one by one questions or anything is fine? Anything is fine. I mean, here in this case, I mean, there's more kind of elaboration needed, not rather a pointed. What? Your choice.
Just you don't want same answer. There's an elaborate entire explanation of the entire thesis, the principle.
Sure, if you want to have more.
Yes, sir.
Sir, as you mentioned, he is not there before a So, how it is possible for Anupramata Jew, Anupramata or Malavratta Jew, which is in Ashuddha, and he has not Anubhuti or Anubhuti of Abhiti. So, how it is possible for what kind of bhakti for that kind of?
Okay. Noted.
Another question, sir. Concept of rasa in Abhinavagupta tradition and in tradition of Vrindavan, what is similarity and differences between them?
That's
For the realization of servitude, does that have to be by identifying the other as superior as a point of aspiration, or inferior or lower in hierarchy as point of empathy?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yes. For the realization of servitude, does it have to be by identifying the other as superior as point of aspiration, or inferior or lower in hierarchy, well, basically lower in hierarchy as point of empathy?
Okay, should I now begin?
So also,
This was a-
One question from Skandapriya.
so could you also elaborate on how compassion is the ground for intersubjectivity or something like that you said? And also, when you're talking about effortlessness, between that comes when one is not abandoning, nor not acquiring. It does refer to detachment in my understanding, but you did say at some point that we're not speaking of the same sort of detachment. So can you also elaborate on that, please?
Okay. Yeah, now there are like things in my head, too many. Yeah. I think, see, there is the confusion that, for instance, you brought in. At some level, of course, that confusion is inevitable in the sense that when you try to navigate these texts, there are a lot of ideas which confuse you all the time. Now, of course, my job as someone who engages with them and should be able to give a clear picture of what's happening. From one point of view, one disclaimer is this: when we use these terms like mind and body, for instance, and subject and object, and for instance, they are loaded terms. They have their own history and so on and so forth. I have to, but not speak. I mean, I have to speak in English. So terms have their own. Pramata means something different from the subject. And when is it that the artha, for instance, that is to say vishaya, also is a subject, for instance, no? Or not only as object. But that is a separate thing. If we try to ignore all those terminologies and just focus on the idea, so his idea is that this non-duality that we are talking about, it is fundamentally the non-distinction between the two. Now that non-distinction between the two, he explains through the terms of, let's take an example of immediate binaries, the opposites. So while we always try to think that pen is a pen because there is the absence of non-penness in the pen, therefore this is a pen. Everywhere else there lies the absence of, there is the existence of the absence of this pen. So this pen is only where this pen is. It cannot reside in its absence. You have the Vedantic debates also about that, from Madhusudana and so on and so forth. And he tries to build that connection, saying that that connection itself is, it's more phenomenological position. That connection itself is the Advaita. What does it mean? It means that, let's say, if I explain in grammatical terms, it's more explicable in Sanskrit grammatical terms. Let's say I use the term which is verbal construction, going. The going, which is a verbal construction, going cannot exist or survive by itself. Going has the potentiality to create its own actor. That is to say, the one who is going. So if you say going, immediately the answer is, who? You have to say that. Like going cannot go by itself. The walker is walking, Nagarjuna's example. So going has to be done by someone. There has to be the pramata of going. Or if you say, okay, Devadatta. Yes, Devadatta. Now what? Devadatta has to be doing something. So that what he emphasizes is that, let's say this verbal construction, by its very existence, because it is a kriya, because it is the kriya pada, the verbal construction, it by itself generates its own subject. Because if it does not, then it ceases to be the kriya pada, then it ceases to be the action. And that is the same applies to the subject. You have Devadatta, Devadatta Hagachati. You have to have that construction. That's how it makes a complete semantic sense. And this is what his idea is about when he says consciousness. The word consciousness in his system is very problematic. But largely, after some 20 years trying to understand what is he trying to do, I think what I understand is that it is again the relationship between this idea from one, let's say, I don't like that word, theological point of view, Shiva and Shakti, they are non-detachable. What does it mean? He gives, again, the example I gave of light. Light and the dynamism of light. When there is light here, you can't point out that light, where is light? There is also light here. No? And light has a twofold property. Why is that becoming important for him? Because light, when coming into being, and that coming into being is an important idea for him, because that means manifestation. The Abhasa idea, unlike the Vedantins' erroneous Abhasa idea. That means real for him. So he would say that the light, when it comes into being, or when it doesn't come into being as if it has initial cause or something, but for explanation. Light has two properties. One, it illuminates, of course it is itself illumination, but it illuminates with its illumination, with its own existence, it illuminates with whatever is there in the sphere of light. So the question from another point of view comes in front of us is that, let's say I see this, I have the perceptorial cognition of this cup right now. Now there is darkness completely. No, I can't see this. So, but when I am seeing this, am I seeing the cup or am I seeing the light? Because I see the cup in the presence of the light. Right? So, am I seeing the cup or am I seeing the light? Right? So, his idea would be that everything is of the nature of light in terms of everything is of the nature of consciousness, and it, like light's very nature is to manifest. It manifests. No? Light, as I said, no, there is light here. It manifests. The very ontological core of the idea of light is that manifestation. So cup is manifesting. The jar, the pot, and so on and so forth, it is manifesting itself unto you. That is what it is, its existence is. And why light becomes also important? Because there is inherent dynamism in the nature of light, of this manifesting. It is not an inert category. That you can easily use as a model, let's say, between this idea of the eternal self and the corporeal self. No? Corporeal self, for him, unlike Vedantins, for instance, or any Nivrittivadins, for instance, it's the body alone that is mokshayate. Body is fundamental. By body is the idea of corporeality. Anything corporeal is fundamentally real, because see, it is more important to understand that why is he doing that. When you see Shankara, for instance, pleading for non-duality, he creates layers, 3 layers of reality, of truth, and so on and so forth. And he creates this, let's say, a certain epistemic model, in disguise, let's say also a Buddhist model, the Apohavada or Abhavavada of Naiyayikas. We cannot, of course, by the very diction of Upanishad, know Brahman, because that's beyond knowledge and so on and so forth. So let's take another part. Nobody can forbid me from inquiring into what is not Brahman. So I am following that path, and that is ironically what the whole Advaitic tradition is doing. They are interested in trying to complicate Maya, trying to complicate empirical, trying to complicate the epistemology itself. No? Here, it's in a sense upside down. Here we are not from above to below. Here we are from below to above. In a sense, to say that if there is the dynamism of this very empirical existence, there has to be a subject who is dynamic. You name it, Pramata, Super Pramata, God, and whatever, you name it, nobody cares from another point. But the dynamism has to have a substratum, a locus, for instance, a Pramata, for instance. So I think that's what it breaks down to, the idea. If I missed something, you can remind me. Some point I missed.
I think I don't know why I understand.
It's hard for him to do it though. And you can see that it's very hard for him to do it. But well, that's for every philosophical system. Yeah.
One thing I would say is that I do profess that sometimes I think they make things a bit complicated.
Yes.
So he's coming to one point, and I think he's going about it in a very complicated way. Well, that's right.
That's the job of philosophers, no?
Yes.
I mean, they make it complicated, of course. You have to complicate the problem to get more out of the problem. You have to exhaust it, no? Otherwise, we will lose our significance. Then I think I have this question about pramata and anupramata and another rasa idea. Can you just quickly repeat it?
As you mentioned, he is not dual for but what about the entities in Ashuddha who have no other than?
But who says that? I mean, from this point of view, if we again if you remember, I used the idea of circularity. You know? Let's say I am in that circular hierarchy just on very above, for instance, on the top. It is not that is absolute forever. That is to say, even if I am completely pure entity in terms of like Paramashiva entity and so on and so forth, you can always be Pashu. You can always come to Ashuddhadvan and you can always be impure again and so on and so forth. The point being, I think the point being that all those categories, all 37, are nowhere but within you, right? That's why body is important. So you have to visualize the whole cosmos. I mean, his whole other discourses, you have to visualize the whole cosmos within, but visualize. Visualization idea itself is very important. What does it mean, visualization? That has to do a lot with, if one understands this model of universal and particular, the Samanya Vishesha model, how do they operate in Nayayika sense, and then how is he making that operate from the Vishesha to the Samanya, Samanya to the Vishesha. So, you can be you can be as an individual the seat of potentiality, right? But that bhakti idea is something which is to be cultivated. So you can. That's why the idea being you are not doing away with the ritual part, even if it is done without any mental involvement and so on and so forth. So be it. It's fine. It's not a problem. But a rule to the exception is, let's say you have that bhavana, you have that involvement, the mental involvement, even in doing something completely wrong and so on and so forth. That itself can also elevate you to whatever the idea is, elevation and so on and so forth. But from some point of view, it is this idea of self, that's why I said these words are so abused, the self-recognition. The recognition idea which he emphasizes, and remember that the knowledge idea for him, even if he accepts all the first three pramanas, but the fundamental cognition idea for him is recognition. So if you try to understand what is cognition and what is recognition and why he emphasizes or rather gives an ontological status to the recognition idea. Because for him, every cognition is a new cognition. It's absolutely new. The time I see you in the morning, the time I see you in the afternoon, every time it's a new cognition. No? Now, of course, it is very problematic from one point of view. It's not that easy. What does it mean? What is the role of memory then? You can invoke Advaita Vedanta, you can invoke his own ideas, for instance. But from another point of view, the simple idea being that how sensitive, and that is at stake, how sensitive is one with respect to the self and with respect to the other. I think the empathy idea was coming there, no? And you can, this is why the connection with, for instance, the pot, for instance. Can you ever know pots knowing of me? Or is the way only that I develop the sensitivity of a certain knowingness or an experience to this level that I really manifest that experience of somebody who is going through pain, for instance. I really know what it is. Even if physically I am not going through the same pain that the other is. That for him would be something that is a matter of practice. That's why the metaphor of heart is invoked every time. That metaphor of heart for him is nothing but that the trope for sensitivity, the central core of this idea of sensitivity. And that sensitivity is what prakasha is. That prakasha is what that purity, absolute pure purity is in those terms. And then second you were saying, while that question can be answered from historical point of view, but the project of the Gaudiya Vaishnava system was to bring bhakti, like this Rupa, for instance, Rupa Goswami in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. He is wanting to bring, in brief, a certain ontological status to the 10th rasa, bhakti, so beyond 9. Because Abhinava is stopping with the Shanta, and for him, Shanta is all that there is. And it stops there. But Rupa has his own then involvement idea of what bhakti means and so on and so forth. Of course, bhakti is not present in Abhinavan paradigm. But then you have to understand, I think, that why and how does everything encapsulate for him in Shanta. See, giving one example for instance, because that structure is very important. He argues in the Lochana, the Dunyadapa Lochana, he would argue that book of war, Mahabharata, it's a book of war. And that's the best example of Shanta Rasa, the tranquil Rasa. Okay? Look at the oppositeness of the idea. That a book of war is the best example of the tranquility, emotion of tranquility, the Shanta. So what does Shanta mean for you? No? You have to invoke all these layers of speech, for instance, Abhida, Lakshana, Vinjana. How does it work for him? And how does Ananda and him both address the problem of Dhvani? From what point of view? And then that Rasa Dhvani and so on and so forth. But while I think this question you are asking from this point of view, if I am emphasizing the quotidianness in this non-dual bhakti, what about another model that we have of bhakti, of Rupa Goswami? So isn't that like the same model? I don't think they are same from a very, and I'm not bringing in the whole metaphysics and so on and so forth. I don't think they are same from the very structural point of view. While Rupa seems to be bringing, he seems to be bringing the whole tradition of aestheticians and stuff, he seems to also contradict Shankara. Seems to be like, even though you can say they are this Achintya Veda idea, they are Dvaitins from that point of view. Why is Shankara the target? He, interestingly to me, he doesn't ever, I think if I remember the text correctly, he doesn't seem to quote anything from Abhinava as such. So, when I was reading that, it also came to my mind like, where is this, what are his sources? When he's referring to that aesthetic solution, what are his sources? Yeah. But you don't need to have direct sources. You are reading in the time that he is in, 15th Irish roughly. That's by that time it has, like, the whole aesthetic tradition has evolved enough to be aware of what was going in Bharata and so on and so forth. Does that make some sense? And then we have, I think, the empathy. Again, if you don't mind, can you repeat the question?
See?
Yes.
So from what I understand, the realization of non-duality requires the dialectics of intersubjectivity, And for that you require compassion. Compassion is the mode to understand the intersubjectivity or to realize it in a way. So is compassion a necessary condition then for non-duality or the realization of non-duality?
No, you can't have conditions. Compassion, I mean, in this sense, compassion means non-duality. Non-duality means compassion.
It's
In this sense that, say for instance, again this example of me being sensitive to somebody's pain. No? Now, am I invoking the example, for instance, of I'm sympathetic to you or I'm empathetic to you? Of course, that they would be different, right? But we are not talking of that empathy. We are saying that when you say non-dual, that compassion is the very fabric of that non-duality. That I understand you as I and I as you.
Got it. Okay.
Right? Now that's very easy to say, but how does one argue for that? No, that's something really important. How does one argue for that? But at least in brief, what I'm saying is that this is why this idea of, for me, this I manifests into the other, that is you. But that you for Sir is I, and I am you for him. Now you see this play rather of the relationship between the you and I. What is that relationship between you and I? Right? So does it mean that, even though we are ontologically completely different, two different beings, yet at the same time there is a certain relationship between two of us? Right? It can be explained also in terms, for instance, sometimes I give example to students. No? So let's say I'm walking on the road and I have, let's say, I meet an accident, God forbid. So, and certainly it so happens accidentally a certain scooter comes and it happens to be my best friend. And then he sees, he's like, completely, his whole life changes. Right? In this terms, like what is it that changes in him with respect to me? As opposed to, if a person is going and let's say some people around are going, we see these things everywhere now. Some people are going and they, bechara, somebody is like lying there on the roadside, what to do? Right? Now, what is that? Is that this idea of what brings that togetherness to that? Is that relationship of emotion? A certain phenomenon that glues I and you together? Right? Now, is it being said here that, that's the relationship you should develop with all others? Because I am self, and there are so many others here, no? Other. And by that virtue, then I have to develop that relationship with the whole cosmos. Right? Me, self, in opposition to the whole cosmos. I should have same relationship if he is teaching that. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm questioning that. If I should have the same relationship with Trump, Obama, X, Y, Z. Do I? No. Yes, that is the whole idea that can there be that universalness of the emotion that you feel? No? Can you feel that towards everyone? Compassion towards everyone in the whole cosmos? Realistically impossible. No, you can't. That's why he gives the example of the whole aesthetic idea. He gives the example only in the drama room, the cinema theatre, right? Where everybody's experience, for instance, would be distinct from each other, and yet everybody's experience would be distinct, everybody's, with respect to what you see, what you perceive, without affecting what is being shown to you, what is being enacted, and so on and so forth. And for him, in that case, Paramatma is the viewer. the watcher. Right? Because actor doesn't start crying. If actor starts crying, actor cannot act. I start crying. No? A certain emotion that is being played there, and I'm like crying. Ironically, the next person sitting to me is like, ha ha ha, this guy is crying. Was this not supposed to be like a mono emotion? No? Projected to you, right? And some other person is like completely indifferent, sitting next to me. So the life of that experiencing is based fundamentally, the inner very fabric of that is this distinction, diversity, the dynamics. And that's what the dynamics is. Because a mono like Brahman's idea, it cannot be dynamic by its very virtue because it's mono. Right? That's why it is nishkriya. There is no kriya possible in that jnana. Right? And how Vedanta has tried to kind of, compromise with that, bringing the whole literature, and there's an answer to all that problem, that what is the relationship of Brahma and Maya. No?
Would you just recommend this? Would you have the opinion that methodically prepares following Chitradvaita?
What is Chitradvaita? But what is variegated non-dualism?
It's suggested by Dharmakirti and later on followed by, of course, Ratnakirti.
Right. So Ratnakirti uses, I'm not aware of Dharmakirti using that expression, but Ratnakirti certainly uses that expression. And I have a paper which I think you refer to, this, what does Abhinavagupta mean by non-duality? And towards the end I have referred to this idea of what, I don't know historically if he was aware of Ratnakirti's that expression or not, probably would have been. But not only he, but also his, in the tradition Somananda, they use this expression Chitra Dvaitavada. Now Chitra means simply, in Sanskrit Chitra means variegated. It means variegated. A picture is variegated, that's why in Hindi, Marathi it's a Chitra. No, because it is variegated. You can't have a mono white and say that it is Chitra. No. The manifesting is because of that arrangement of colors. Right? So, absolutely, now you see the Chitra is variegated and then you have Chitra Advaita. The non-duality of variegatedness, literally to say that. So, variegated non-dualism. And I have argued that that's what it means. That's why Abhinavagupta's system, he uses those expressions somewhere. But it's very clear that even though that
this is methodically an application of Chitra, because you just keep it up till something an object in the epistemic process, whereas it seems that Trika is going beyond that and it's universally applying it. Even in case of compassion or the hierarchy, everywhere it seems to be applying.
And the core of that unity is that idea of diversity. These words are complicated, but I give example often of if I have, let's say, 5 pens together. So I say group of pen. Where is the groupness? In each pen individually. And now each pen is like thrown away. Where is the groupness? No? So you can try to complicate through that grupatvam, like the Naiyayikas, grupatvam putravartate of this. And individual penness, where is this? So that groupness is in them being together, and together means that they have to be many for that. Many. Oneness of something, it's like that expression, oneness of many, oneness of 5 pens. They represent one group of pens, but for group you have to have 5 pens, at least 2. So that whole idea of Advaita is based on Bheda. If there is no Bheda, there is no Abheda at all. And from another point of view, it means if there is Shiva, there has to be Shakti. If there is Shakti, there has to be Shiva. Because the potentiality of the groupness is in that dynamic form of groupness.
Shall we stop here?
Yes.
Then we can have, if some more questions, then we can have over the lunch. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Very but something to process. Yeah.
I'm myself struggling to understand.
So it's like